Hello, I'm Jeremy, and today I'm going to be talking about a game by the name of The Quest for El Dorado, The Golden Temples, and this is a spin-off and also an expansion for the game The Quest for El Dorado, which is designed by Reiner Knizia. It's from a few years back. This is essentially a sequel and also an expansion for this game. It could be played on its own, but it could also be combined with this game if you want to have bigger maps and more variety in the cards and tokens that are included in the game. And like this game, it still does play between 2 to 4 players in about 45 to 60 minutes. I wouldn't say it radically complicates the game or changes the amount of time that it'll take to play the game. And the box says that it is for ages 10 and up, which I think is still true. This is, if you are able to play the original, you'll have no problem picking up what's going on in this game. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that you're familiar with the Quest for El Dorado, the original one, and I will explain what's different in this expansion. Then I will come back and let you know what I think about the game. So here we have a setup for the Quest for El Dorado, the Golden Temples, and I'm not going to go into all of the rules for the game because I've already done a rules overview for the base game, so you can watch that. I'm going to more talk about what's different in this expansion. Actually, it is a bit of a misnomer to call it an expansion because it could play standalone by itself, and here's an example of what the setup would look like for the game, just with the components that you would get in this new box. So this is an adventure game, a deck building game, where players are going to be using cards to move across this board. And whereas in the base game, players would move along a linear path in hopes of being the first person to reach an exit. Here, the game, as the name of the expansion implies, is about these temples. So there's 3 of these temples here that are spread across the board. And players in any order are going to be able to move to those 3 temples, collect a gem. They can only take 1 gem from each temple, and then try to be the first person to reach it back to this space, which is near the start. So players could tackle those in any order, and that makes the game a little bit more open-ended. Something you'll also notice if you're familiar with the base game is that there is a new terrain type on the board, these torches. So because of that, there are now cards that will enable you to move across this torch type of landscape. I should mention that these tiles can be mixed and matched with the game tiles from the first expansion as well as from the first base game. So you could certainly do that, as can the cards. The game comes with a whole new slew of cards. I'll explain those in a second. Some other new features are some of these barriers on the board, which the first person to move across one of them has to pay something, will affect other players instead of that. So other players might get a benefit. For example, other players will all be able to draw 1 card instead of that player having to pay extra to move across that. The other mechanism that's new to the game is tied to these wooden coins. Players could have up to 3 of these at one time. They could get them sometimes by drawing cards or by having things happen on the board. For example, if a player claims this barrier, all other players will get 1 of these coins. And these can be spent on a future turn to either traverse a 1 coin space, or any number of them can be added to, well, up to 3 could be added to your purchasing of a card. You still get to purchase cards in the normal sense as you would with the base game. So the starter decks for the game are slightly more powerful than they are in the base game, but they also include cards that let you traverse the fire, which makes sense because the majority of these tiles have fire on them. And something else that you'll notice is that you start with a multi-use card. There are more multi-use cards available for purchase than there are in the base game, and I'll just kind of go through the cards that are new here. Again, these could be combined with the other 2 expansions. Essentially what would happen if you wanted to combine this with one of the expansions, you would use the starter deck from the base game, and then you would put the base game starter cards up here, and then out of the other cards that you're using the expansions for, you would take 12 of them at random and create the new market from those 12 cards. So the cards, some of them are special, some of them are simply upgraded versions of your move on the torch icon. So here's a 5 movement for the torch. This is move across any 2 torch hexes regardless of what number are in them. There's an upgraded money card here. One thing I'll note is this one here has this black border here with the 7. Some of the high cost cards in this expansion are now marked that you can't claim them as a free action with the card that lets you just claim a card from the market. You could only get this through buying it with coins. And then there are a lot of these multi-use cards, some that you could use multiple times, some that are one and done, like as indicated by this marker. And then there are several cards that are just brand new benefits or new special abilities. This one here, you get to take one of those gold coins I explained and draw another card. Here you get to pay gold coins to move across any number, or up to 3 hexes, so you can pay coins to just move. Here you get 3 coins right away, and then you could buy a card from the top of the market. This one, take a coin, move a space regardless of what's in it. This one is you could, I'll explain that one. This one is you get a coin and you could call a card from your hand, very handy. And this one is just move 2 spaces and then you'll discard the card. So pretty in line with what was already in the first 2 versions of this game, but some nice new twists on it. The last real twist of the game is tied to these tokens here on the board. These are essentially temples that function similarly to the caves in the base game, but a little bit, almost a reverse of that, I suppose. If ever you stop your movement next to one, what you'll do is you'll flip that tile up, and it'll show something generally that's going to affect other players positively. So instead of you getting a positive benefit, if you choose to stop near one of those, other players are going to get a positive benefit. And it'll happen every time a player either moves and comes back, or another player moves and stops by that. So here in this case, all the other players would get a coin. So it sometimes will add strategic decisions about maybe taking the longer route to avoid giving other players a benefit. Some of these do negatively affect you. I know there's one that says you lose all of your coins, for example, but generally they help the other players more than they hurt you. There are some spaces on here, for example, now that indicate you have to discard one of those cardboard coins in order to get rid of this or to step onto these temple spaces. So just to explain again how these temples work, in order to claim a gem, you just have to move your figure onto it. Any of these 3 spaces will do. Then you get to claim the gem, and you can only take one from each of the 3 temples. Once you've done that, then you just move to an adjacent space to this starting temple, and then by doing that, you would finish the game. Your piece will come off, and if other players don't finish in the same turn, then you will be the winner. Otherwise, winner is still, if in the case of a tie, is still determined by the borders that you've collected. One thing I'll mention, I guess, just because I noticed it, because I did play this 2 players, is that the 2-player rules are mostly similar to the base game, where each player is going to be, using 2 figures, and they all have to reach back to the starter temple. So I have an English-German version of the game, and in my 2-player rules, there's no mention of this in the English rules. So there is a 2-player rules here, and you can see no mention of this, but there's a rule in the German version that I noticed that is that essentially this rule here says that in order to claim the green gem, players have to move in a 2-player game both of their figures onto that simultaneously in order to get that gem. Otherwise, you can't pick that up with just one guy there. So that does make a little bit more sense than the English rules. I'm not sure if that's an official change or a mistake, or if the German rule is considered a variant, but I figured I should point that out because it does affect the way that the 2-player game is going to work. Otherwise, you could just send one guy here and this other guy to these 2, and then just rush back. That forces you to be a little bit more thoughtful in the way that you plan to get to that green temple, because you'll have to basically do it with both figures. Anyway, I just figured I'd bring that up because it was an issue that I noticed. Otherwise, everything seems pretty legible as far as the rules go. And I would say pretty much, if you're familiar with the base game, you'll have a pretty good understanding of what you're getting in this new version. Okay, so that is the quest for El Dorado, the Golden Temples. And as you can see, a lot of the elements from the original game have been retained here, but there are just enough tweaks for those who might have found themselves having run through what the original game had to offer. So I think that does make it a good expansion. I think that if you're buying this as a standalone game, it might actually offer less in the box than the base game would. There are fewer tiles, I think, in the box. I guess I didn't go back and count, but I'm pretty sure there are fewer tiles in the box. There's only 4 or 5 in this, so you're a little bit more limited in the maps that you're going to be able to configure, although they are all two-sided still. I don't think I showed that in the component overview, but just to see, so you can see they're all still two-sided, so there's still a lot of variety, make no mistakes about it. And the nature of the maps in this game, because they're going to require you to zigzag and go back and forth across the path, does change the way that the maps get used in this version. So I think the people who are going to get the most out of this, though, are the people who do own the original game, and maybe the original game and the first expansion, because this just adds a lot of variety and really a whole new way to play with that new element of collecting those jewels before you come home. Something that I'll say about that is, on one hand, that does make the game more strategic. It certainly makes you think less linearly about your path. You don't just have one set obstacle in front of you. You could tackle them in any order, which you may choose based on the cards that are available in the market to do that in a certain order. And because there's only 3 copies of each card, other players may be forced to go on a different route first, because the card that they would really want to tackle, say a given terrain type, may not be available to them. At the same time, that ability to go off in your own direction, do your own thing, does make it feel slightly less like a race, and there's slightly less blocking. You can't traverse spots that are occupied by other players in this game, and often that would become really contentious, where you could just block another player by sitting there and buying cards. Here that's less likely to happen, which does increase the tension in some ways, but at the same time makes it less directly confrontational than the original game was. And that's, I guess, something to consider when you're determining if you want to get this. Something that I have also noticed in this one, because of the nature of it, is it seems like more than with the base game, and this is based on now 4 plays, some with just the new components, some with the combined components. It does seem like you more often seem to get a breakaway win, or somebody who wins by, like, 2 or 3 turns, whereas that was pretty rare in the base game. Usually you come down to a turn or 2. So just very slightly, I've noticed more tendency to somebody really breaking out ahead, and once they have the 3 gems, and other players left to go and collect gems, and they're just heading back, a little bit of the element of suspense kind of deflates out of this in a way that didn't. I've certainly seen in the base game players come from behind, and the player who spent time culling their deck all of a sudden is moving 5 spaces with every card play, whereas the other person's just going 1 space at a time because they have their starter cards still left in their deck. So that seems to be less prevalent here, but that could just be the few games I've played, and it could be also a factor or a side effect of the various cards, because this game uses a random card setup every time you play. You might get games that make a particular terrain type to be harder to navigate than others, and because of that, I would almost recommend that you always include, if you're using the random setup, at least some of the cards that let you traverse multiple terrain types. Because if you use the new tiles that have torches on them, and you don't have any cards that let you naturally traverse torches, that could be a pretty arduous game. There are ways around that, of course. There are cards that let you move 1 space onto any type of terrain, but again, you can only ever get 3 of a given card type, so it seems like I almost wish that, because of this being a family game, that they had included recommended card setups, but they really don't. If you're combining the sets, they just say use the base set, the base starter cards, and then randomize the other 12. So I think that's in the interest of keeping the game's rules streamlined, but I don't necessarily know that it will make for the most balanced or most streamlined game experience every time. I guess multiple plays will bear that out, but it's just something that seems like you could have oddball games where it's certainly harder to go across one terrain type because of that. Of course, you could avoid that just by playing with the stuff that comes in this new box, which does include a lot of the multiple terrain type cards and does work well. So I'm not sure that that's an issue as something that you might run into when you just randomly combine things. There are some guidelines, as there were in the base game, that tell you how to build a map that won't be frustrating, but there really isn't that for the card building, so I figured I'd bring that up. Overall, though, I think because of the open-ended nature of this, it's a more strategic game than just the original was, and it has a slightly freer feel, so you can go off in your own direction, even though you're all working towards the same goals, and I think that that's nice, and that freedom, I think, does come with the potential for a player to put themselves in a bad situation, more than in the base game where you could just see directly what was ahead for you. I think it's definitely overall a better expansion to the base game than the first expansion, which just added a lot of random elements. And I thought was okay, but it didn't really renew the base game for me. Whereas this one, with the option to add those multiple temples and change essentially the game-winning strategy and objective, it really does open it up and make it something new. So I think people who like the base game will probably love adding this to the base game. And I guess I'll just kind of leave it there. Overall, I think it is a nice addition to the series, and if you are a fan of the original, I would recommend that you pick it up or try it. And if you have not yet played the original, I would say start with the first game, even though this one does stand alone, just because there's more variety in that base box. So those are my thoughts on the quest for El Dorado, the Golden Temples, and thank you for watching.